After years of tension, much planning, and the occasional English raid, the Armada was finally in the English Channel. As it proceeded up the channel at approximately the pace of a brisk walk, which was about as quick as some of its slower ships could go, King Philip's secret instructions insisted on the Armada making its way to Margate and making secure a path for Parma's army to cross. Exactly how this was to be done, and where the landings were to take place, the king unusually left unsaid. This was to be worked out between Medina Sidonia and the Duke of Parma. Quite how the two were supposed to communicate, with almost every seaworthy ship flying the English or Dutch banners separating the two, was not elaborated upon, save for a suggestion of landing a messenger in Normandy and presuming that the French would be too distracted to stop him, or perhaps the French would just cooperate. After all, the Dutch and the English were heretics, and France, like Spain, was a good Catholic country at this point. But at least there were a couple of backup plans. The first was, if for some reason it was not possible to secure Parma's crossing, the Armada was to double back and seize the Isle of Wight as a foothold and fleet base, and then work out what they wanted to do from there. The second backup plan was, if the landings in Kent were successful, but somehow the English pulled a rabbit out of the hat and managed to stalemate or defeat the veteran Spanish army, they were instead to extract concessions around the exercise of the Catholic faith in England and surrender of the towns that the English held that blockaded access to Antwerp. If possible, a war indemnity would also be extracted, but Philip allowed that this could be a bargaining chip that could be revoked from the list of claims if it would help the other two conditions be met. Both Medina Sidonia and Parma were also instructed to send daily messages back to Spain so that Philip could continue to micromanage the expedition, although quite how he intended to do so when the messages and their reply, assuming that the messages were sent in the first place, would take over a week to make the round trip at best, and thus be entirely useless in a campaign where situations were changing by the hour, was also left unsaid. Philip also added a postscript. In the event that the invasion failed, hostages would also be needed to guarantee that the conditions imposed on the English were kept, and a garrison should be left in a number of English towns that presumably by that point had already been captured to monitor the fulfilment of the concessions, with the army not leaving until those concessions were well underway. Even with Medina Sidonia's careful planning and administration skill, the Armada did not actually have enough ammunition for a long campaign, with the ships carrying around 50 shots per gun. So Philip instructed that close-range fire only should be employed to maximise the effect of this limited ammunition. There was also the matter of battle formation. The Armada arrived as an approximate blob, but a blob was a relatively unsuited formation for battle. Medina Sidonia's original plan in some ways resembled the Zulu infantry tactic of the bull's horns, albeit that tactic was obviously a few centuries in the future. The most powerful fighting ships and the galleasses would form a core group in the centre. Behind them would be the rest of the heavy fighting ships, the galleys, and 3 groups of smaller supply and scouting craft. On either flank would be staggered horns that sweeping forward that consisted of 20 medium-sized warships apiece, with clusters of supporting ships, transports, and light craft positioned behind them. Reductions in the overall number of ships present in the Armada, as well as the galleys' departure, meant that this plan was revised down to 30 warships positioned in the middle, with 15 on each flank, still with the support ships clustered behind each group. This was based on tactical manuals of the time, which advised not to sail in line ahead, as this was held to only allow the lead ships to fight, which was paired with advice not to mount heavy guns on the broadside, reserving these areas for lighter pieces that would allow a raking of the enemy deck when boarding came. Instead, like the galleys and to an extent the galleasses, the heavy guns should instead be mounted in the bow first, so that a fleet sweeping down on its opposition in line abreast could maximise its heavy anti-ship firepower in the opening volleys. Hence the crescent-shaped layout of the formation, which would enable all the leading warships to bring their heavy bow guns to bear at the same time. It's important to note that a number of sub-commanders disagreed. They appreciated, usually through previous experience, the English advantage of speed and agility, and they wanted all of the vulnerable ships to be clustered in the middle, with the warships positioned in two groups, one at the front and one at the rear, to guard against incursion from either direction. The forward-swept crescent formation proposed had another weakness. By clustering the biggest ships in the middle, it meant that all the squadron's flagships were positioned together and away from their respective commands. In an era when detailed instructions had to essentially be shouted across to nearby ships if they hadn't been preset by letter, this could spell disaster for any attempt to coordinate complex actions by squadron. Intelligence meant that the Spanish were well aware that the English would probably try for a long-range gunnery duel to smash the hulls of their enemies near the waterline. However, the only solution that anyone seemed to have to remedy this particular situation was, we'll try to board them instead? If they managed to get this close, an interesting array of incendiaries was available, ranging from simple fire pots with a primitive form of napalm in them, along with flaming darts and arrows, and a rather adventurous device called a bomba, which contained a series of gunpowder charges of differing densities, the idea being that as a ship closed, these would be aimed and lit, whereupon a series of looser-packed gunpowder charges would spew flame for several seconds before they burnt down to a denser charge which was packed with shrapnel, which would blast out over the enemy deck, which would also then ignite another series of low-order charges, and so on until the weapon ran out of powder. However, these were marked as only to be handled by experts, as the wooden barrel devices had a disturbing tendency to just explode like a 6-foot-long wooden pipe bomb moments after they were lit. Extensive measures were taken to deal with the potential for fires. Barrels of water and vinegar were distributed liberally across the ships, as was an early form of fire extinguisher that, more than anything else, resembles a giant syringe, which was filled by placing the front end into a bucket and drawing back the plunger. You then aimed it at the fire, depressing the plunger with speed, which would send out a jet of water. This is essentially the same mechanism that drives the very simplest of children's water guns these days. By contrast, the English fleet planned to sail with their most powerful ships in the centre of the formation, each paired with a merchant ship and a small pinnace. This latter smaller ship was mainly there to give each pair the ability to communicate with its superior officers, and the merchant ship was paired with the warship to try and even out the overall firepower of the fleet. These centrally positioned ships were generally the older, less agile, traditionally built galleons, with the wings of the English formation made up of the race-built galleons and the faster merchants. The English tactics would, at least at first, consist of the largest ships using their heavy bow guns at standoff ranges, whilst the nimbler ships raced in, delivering salvos from their own bow guns before wheeling about, giving a broadside, and then a salvo from the aft guns, and then the other broadside, and round again in a carousel of constant fire until they were either forced to break off due to damage, or other ships coming up for their turn. In this effort, they were aided by most of their guns being mounted on compact four-wheel carriages that meant the guns were relatively easy to handle and reload, and will be familiar to anyone who's been to an Age of Sail era museum ship. The carriage design itself wasn't massively new, but it was considerably more modern than the bulk of the Armada's guns, which were placed on long two-wheel mountings that had a long tail that dragged on the deck, which was very similar, if not identical to, depending on the gun, the more unwieldy land-based gun carriages. Records seem to indicate that some of the larger-sized Portuguese galleons had some of their guns on similar mountings to the English, which would make sense because the Portuguese at this time in history were usually at the cutting edge of naval combat in some way, shape or form. But both the same records and the wrecks that have been investigated subsequently indicate that the land-type two-wheel mounting was by far the most common mounting found on Spanish guns, and thus in use by the Spanish gunners. All of these factors would feed into the next few days. By the morning of the 30th of July, the Armada had advanced 20 miles past the Lizard, but was still 60 miles from Plymouth. Drake might as well have organised a fleet-wide bowls tournament at that rate of advance. And Medina Sidonia seemed content to advance his fleet at this stately pace, much to the dismay of Recalde and some others, who advocated taking their fastest warships ahead to Plymouth and engaging the English fleet as it left harbour. The confined waters would negate the English long-range artillery advantage, and thus make the best use of the boarding strength of the Spanish ships. But Medina Sidonia, whilst agreeing that the idea was sound in principle, was equally determined to keep the fleet together, and thus he ordered them to furl sails each night. Lord Howard took full advantage of the Spanish delay, and on the night of the 30th through 31st of July, the English fleet left Plymouth. Drake's squadron tacked west between the Armada and the coast, whilst 5 ships with substantial masts and rigging made a great show of hovering in the moonlight just outside Plymouth Harbour. The bulk of the English fleet followed Howard south across the face of the Armada and then circled around it to seaward, mirroring Drake's squadron, with the two forces meeting up behind the Spanish before dawn. With the wind sweeping up the channel from the west, this meant that the English had the weather gauge. Essentially, they could choose when to fight and when to fall back, and there was little the Armada could do except grin and bear it, fighting only on English terms. In response, Medina Sidonia hoisted his battle flag, and the Armada formed up. Since the English were now behind them instead of ahead, the crescent formation likewise was now swept back instead of forward, with the more vulnerable ships positioned ahead and the warships and the large merchants arrayed between them and the English fleet. Although the two countries had essentially been in a state of open warfare for several years, there had technically not been an official declaration as such for this campaign, and so in keeping with tradition, which was largely derived from land-based warfare, where in this kind of situation commanders would ride out and formally issue challenges, Lord Howard sent out a single ship to issue such a challenge. But since sending a representative to march up onto the deck of the San Martin and belt Medina Sidonia across the face with a steel gauntlet would probably not have ended well for the man who was carrying the gauntlet or his ship, the appropriately named vessel Disdain raced ahead, completed a 360-degree wheeling series of broadsides, and, honour satisfied, headed back to the fleet. With the gauntlet thrown down, or more accurately fired at high velocity at the Spanish, the English fleet launched its attack at 9 a.m. For the next 4 hours, conga lines of English ships approached the Armada. First the coastward wing and then later the seaward one, each delivering a carousel of fire before falling back in favour of the next ship in line and rejoining the queue. A few Spanish ships lost their nerve under the continuous hail of fire and broke for the protection of the centre, but most, including Recalde aboard the San Juan de Portugal, stood firm, albeit Recalde noted there was much damage to his rigging, including a shot that punched a hole neatly through both his mainmast and foremast at the same time. This prolonged skirmish, which is sometimes optimistically termed the Battle of Plymouth or the Battle of Eddystone, saw the English realise that as long as the Armada kept its formation, they dared not approach too close, which in turn limited the effect of their gunnery. Conversely, the Spanish officers positioned out on the wings felt that continued attacks like this might lead to a death by 1,000 cuts, as rudders, rigging and masts were damaged or destroyed, with some serious concern for some of the larger vessels which had been converted from merchantmen, which lacked heavy guns, who then might invite closer and more damaging passes from the English ships, as they gradually sorted out which of the larger vessels returned fire more or less enthusiastically. The action died off just after lunch, and there'd been pretty much no firing for about 2 hours, without any loss of ships on either side, when about 3 in the afternoon, out of nowhere, the mighty San Salvador, like the already lost Santa Ana, one of the largest and most powerful ships, and thus carrying much gold, was rent by a catastrophic explosion. Theories abound as to what exactly caused this to happen, with the relatively pedestrian explanation of too much loose gunpowder being left on deck in an attempt to supply the guns as quickly as possible, inviting a single spark, which sounds plausible, save that the bulk of the fighting, as said, had ended 2 hours earlier. And then there's another account which claimed that the captain had threatened to kill one of the gun captains, bearing in mind that most of the gun captains aboard the Armada were foreign experts hired into Spanish service, unless the said gun captain could hit the occasionally approaching English vessels with more regularity, to which the gunner, who had apparently been putting up with this for quite a while, apparently threw a slow match into some nearby powder barrels and hurled himself over the side, presumably backwards with both middle fingers in the air. Whatever the cause, the aft castle of the ship effectively ceased to be, as did the aft section of the gun decks and all connection to the rudder. Half of the crew were killed or badly wounded instantly, and she began to fall out of line toward the English fleet. Luckily, the fires that threatened the 7 tons of powder stored in the main magazines were suppressed thanks to Medina Sidonia's firefighting preparations. Other ships came alongside to get tow cables attached, and the surviving wounded were evacuated to the hospital ships. The smaller ships of the Armada towed the stricken vessel into the heart of the formation to try and effect repairs. Then another of the big ships, yet again another treasure-carrying vessel, this time Nuestra Señora del Rosario, ran into trouble. She was trying to reinforce Recalde's position when she collided with another vessel, losing her bowsprit and tearing the main sail on the foremast. She too made for the centre to effect repairs, but the seas began to rise. Then her foremast collapsed onto the mainmast, and with only the mizzen sails left, the Rosario lost control and began to fall back out of formation. Perhaps afraid of becoming exposed in their turn, none of the other ships came to her assistance, and the Rosario was gradually left behind. By about 9 in the evening, English ships began nipping at the defences of the mighty squadron flagship. The Spanish ship stood off these assaults from smaller craft overnight, but by morning Drake had showed up at musket shot range with the sleek and powerful Revenge, much to the anger of Frobisher, who noted that Drake was supposed to have been carrying a lantern so that the rest of the fleet could keep station with the Armada overnight, based on Drake's position. Instead, Frobisher charged, probably correctly, Drake had seen a chance for much loot and had instead gone after the drifting Spaniard. Drake made little reply to the charges, possibly hoping that Frobisher wouldn't realise that Frobisher's assumption that Rosario carried 15,000 gold ducats was wrong. She actually carried 52,000. But in any case, after some negotiation in which Drake pointed out that Rosario was in a hopeless position, the Spanish ship surrendered. The two captains seemed to have struck some sort of deal during these negotiations, as once the ship had been looted, both men swore blind that the ship had only carried something between 22 and 25,000 ducats, with the other half of the treasure mysteriously vanishing into thin air, albeit the Spanish captain and Drake were not wanting for loose change in the aftermath of the campaign. The whole episode had meant that the English fleet had dropped back overnight, leaving the leading ships with Lord Howard somewhat exposed, and thus they needed another day for the rest of the fleet to catch up, which gave the Spanish some much-needed time to patch up the worst of the damage from the battle the day before. But it turned out the San Salvador could not be saved, and with collapsed decking obstructing the Spanish ability to recover her gold, she too began to fall behind, to be collected by ships under Hawkins' command and towed into Weymouth. The Armada was less than 48 hours past first contact with the enemy fleet, and between the San Salvador and the Rosario plus the Santa Ana, they were just over 150,000 gold ducats down, with 2/3 of these funds having fallen into English hands. With the English having spent most of the 1st of August catching up, the stage was then set for the next significant encounter, the Battle of Portland Bill. The defending English ships were trailing the Armada, but no one aboard had any real idea what the Armada's goal was, thanks to the confusion of intercepted orders mentioned previously. And so Lord Howard resolved simply to keep the pressure on them, coursing them, as he described it, using a hunting term where swift dogs are used to flush prey and keep it running until it gets exhausted. That way, he reasoned, he didn't actually need to know where the Spanish wanted to land. He just had to make sure they wouldn't be able to stop and deploy boats before the English fleet started to bombard them, and whilst the big Spanish ships were proving irritatingly resilient, a small boat loaded with armoured soldiers and a couple of cannon was decidedly less likely to survive a heavy cannon shot or two. Early in the morning on the 2nd of August, as the fleets passed Portland Bill, the wind fell. The Armada was close enough packed that even though it was drifting, it was still roughly in formation, whilst the English fleet, which was more spread out, began to separate. The Armada responded with commendable alacrity. The galleasses, able to move independent of the wind thanks to their banks of oars, were sent after an isolated formation which was led by Frobisher, although their progress in this task was noted as somewhat lackadaisical by the other Spanish commanders. Then the wind rose again, but this time it came from the east, giving the Armada the weather gauge. The bulk of the English fleet then tried to haul across the wind to get between the Armada and the shore, but the Spanish cut them off and began to close the range. The massive Regazzona, a 1,300-ton ex-Venetian merchant ship loaded with heavy guns, and also the flagship of the Levantine squadron, charged in alongside the Rata Encoronada, an ex-Genoese vessel of 800 tons, and the 1,200-ton Santa Ana, which is different from the previous one because this one was only spelt with one N in Ana, which was flagship of the squadron of Guipúzcoa, which is in the Basque region of Spain. The range closed rapidly until a number of lesser English ships were actually in boarding range of the Regazzona, which instead chose to bear down on the Ark Royal, ignoring the smaller craft. This turned out to be a minor mistake, as it bought the English fleet a few minutes, which was enough for the attempt to reach the coast to be abandoned, as the swifter English ships then wheeled and ran before the wind, drawing away slightly and engaging in a prolonged gun duel that lasted about 3 hours. However, this action now separated the fleet further from Frobisher's leading vessels, consisting of 4 large armed merchantmen from London and his flagship, Triumph, the largest ship in the English fleet, and pretty much the only one that had a chance if it came to grappling with one of the Spanish flagships. The galleasses put on a burst of speed and surged for the becalmed galleon, which put up a desperate and extraordinarily rapid fire with every single gun it possessed. This caused the galleasses to shy from their headlong approach and instead try to batter the small English formation with their bow-mounted heavy guns. Their efforts, to be fair, almost bore fruit. One of the London merchantmen was almost driven to strike its colours, and a heavy ball shattered part of the Triumph's rudder. Aboard the San Lorenzo, the flagship of the galleasses, the soldiers called for the ship to close and board, but Don Hugo de Moncada y Grala, commander of the galleasses, claimed he had no orders from Medina Sidonia to conduct any boarding actions, and thus declined to press his chance. A few moments afterwards, the wind rose, and a mixture of Triumph's boats and her own sails wheeled her about, and she slipped away. Watching from the main formation, a furious Medina Sidonia was said to have dispatched one of his staff aboard a small boat to board the San Lorenzo in order, and I quote, "to say aloud to Don Hugo certain words which were not to his honour." Elsewhere, the fresh wind was turning the tables on the Armada in a more dramatic fashion. Seeing a number of the Armada's most powerful ships now strung out in their charge after the Ark Royal, Howard caught the rising wind, which was now back to coming from the west, and summoned the most powerful and swiftest of the Queen's ships to his side. Wheeling about and sailing straight at the gap in the Armada's formation that the charge had opened up, Ark Royal, Revenge, Dreadnought, Victory, Mary Rose, White Bear, and the White and Golden Lions formed up with other ships and raced in, holding their fire until musket range was achieved before delivering devastating broadsides in all directions. Recalde tried to stand against the charge, but with many of the ships nearby being supply ships and smaller craft, since the heavy fighting wing of the Armada was off elsewhere, he could only report that his ship had fought without any succour from any other ship in the Armada because they all seemed to want to take refuge one behind the other. So they all fled from the action and collided together. It's a disgrace to mention it. Elsewhere, also attempting to contain the breach, was Medina Sidonia aboard the San Martin. Likewise unsupported, the fleet flagship fought ferociously, getting away 80 shots of heavy guns, but receiving more than 500 direct hits from various calibers in return, vanishing for a while behind a cloud of gun smoke and splinters. But, although willing to dish out the damage with their guns, The English ships were under no illusions of what would happen if they slowed down to grapple and board any Spanish ships, even if the two senior officers of the Armada were fighting single ship holding actions and otherwise easy targets, since of course as soon as an English ship slowed to a halt, the other Spanish ships in the formation might decide to mob them. And so the Queen's ships wheeled away back east, even as the heavy Spanish ships made their own belated turns back towards the main formation. With the battle over, both commanders reorganised. Medina Sidonia altered the Armada's formation from a long crescent to something a little closer to an approximate circle made up of two hemispheres, with the majority of the good fighting ships in two squadrons in the rearguard, along with three of the galleasses, which now had explicit orders to conceal themselves amongst the other ships and then immediately emerge to take advantage of whatever opportunities their unique capabilities afforded. Both sides had expended a lot of ammunition over the course of the day, but this was much more of a problem for the English, who relied on their guns, whereas the Spanish would be quite happy if everyone had run out of shot and was forced to fight purely hand-to-hand. All in all, unless and until resupply was possible, the Spanish had actually come out ahead strategically, even if tactically they'd taken the most damage and been somewhat outmanoeuvred. The English fleet continued to stalk the Spanish, but Howard did not want to re-engage in a significant way until more powder and shot had been sent out from the English ports that they were passing. As the sun began to set, the Isle of Wight appeared to port ahead, and everyone wondered if the Spanish might try to seize the Spithead anchorage. Certainly aboard the Spanish flagship, having heard nothing from Palmer despite numerous messages being sent on ahead by boat, it must have been tempting to find somewhere to anchor up and wait. On the 3rd, a few small resupply ships reached the English from Portsmouth, but another opportunity also arose. The Gran Griffon, flagship of the Urcas, large storeships of a roughly similar size but somewhat lighter construction to the big galleons, was seen trailing the left flank of the Armada. Although most Urcas were seen as combatants of last resort, Gran Griffon was large enough to have its place in the line of heavy fighting ships, where it had fought well, if somewhat clumsily on account of its somewhat ungainly storeship-shaped hull. It might well have been a trap, but it also was not a chance that could be ignored, so the Revenge started to send broadsides into the isolated ship at close range, very carefully keeping a little distance as several hundred Spanish soldiers were visible on the upper decks just waiting for some idiot to sail into grappling range. The situation began to escalate as the San Juan and San Martin led a rescue party. They were collectively hit by another 330 rounds for their troubles, but provided enough cover for the galleasses to sweep in and take the battered Gran Griffon under tow. The Spanish ships then withdrew to the main formation, still under fire, and the English, unwilling to be led into what was now a very obvious trap, let them go. As the smoke cleared, the fleets were approaching the eastern end of the Solent. This was a make-or-break point. If the Armada continued east, there was no further large safe anchorage on the English coast until they reached the Downs, which were past the Straits of Dover. On the other hand, not only would seizing the Solent and possibly the Isle of Wight provide the Armada with a short-term safe base of operations, but it would also cut off the English fleet from the reinforcements and supplies waiting in Portsmouth. Desperate to avoid this, Howard reformed the English fleet into 4 distinct squadrons, each led by a senior officer, himself, Frobisher, Drake, and Hawkins. Each was given specific instructions for an upcoming engagement whose sole objective was to occupy the Spanish for long enough for the wind to sweep everyone past the Solent and down towards Dover. At that point, the Spanish would have to turn back against the wind and fight their way through the English if they wanted to take Portsmouth or the Solent or the Isle of Wight. Meanwhile, the supply ships and some warships that were still in Portsmouth would be released and could come up behind the English fleet to reinforce them at will. As dawn rose on the 4th, 2 more large vessels were seen trailing the Armada. The English sensed bait, but since there was no wind, there was little anyone could do about it anyway, until eventually Howard's ships drifted close enough that they could lower their boats and have them tow their parent ships into gun range. Almost immediately, and to almost nobody's surprise, 3 of the galleasses instantly appeared from the Spanish formation, one of them even towing the Rata Encoronada behind it. However, the trap had not been sprung with enough strength, and the galleasses rapidly began to accumulate damage as a quarter of the English fleet began bombarding them. Eventually, with one of the galleasses taking on a distinct list and the others suffering various damages, the galleasses took the 2 stragglers under tow, did an about-face, and sailed back to rejoin the Armada. To the north, meanwhile, Frobisher's squadron had made its way to stand off the eastern tip of the Isle of Wight. His flagship, the aforementioned rather massive Triumph, suddenly seemed to have developed difficulties, and the leftmost group of heavy Spanish ships raced towards both Triumph and the Solent. But 2 things now occurred that caused the Spanish to break off. Firstly, the wind rose, and Triumph magically regained its ability to sail. Medina Sidonia's more experienced sailors then realised from the breakers that they could see that the seaway occupied by the English was treacherous. Frobisher was likely using local knowledge to try and lure them into a trap made up of shallow water and shoals. Even today, after almost 5 centuries of erosion and a lot of dredging to open up a ferry channel, the coastline off of Bembridge on the Isle of Wight remains quite shallow and very difficult to navigate for vessels of any appreciable size outside of the aforementioned more modern shipping channels. The other factor was the other 3 English squadrons, which once again took advantage of the Spanish heavy ships being drawn away from the main formation to sweep down on the exposed Spanish shipping and blast away rather eagerly. The Spanish combat force fell back to drive off the English fleet, and by the time the smoke cleared, both formations had indeed drifted east of the Solent with a following wind. With his objective achieved, but now very low on ammunition, Howard was content to follow the Armada until they got near Dover, taking the chance to send requests ashore for more supplies, as well as knighting Hawkins and Frobisher. Drake, of course, had already been knighted for his exploits aboard the Golden Hind some years earlier. Medina Sidonia, on the other hand, used the respite to make repairs to his ships and to send further messages to Parma, including a request for more powder and shot, specifically in the 4 to 10 pound weight range, this apparently having been fired at considerably greater volumes than the heavy shot of the big guns, which took quite some time to reload. Both sides spent the 5th not doing all that much, since a lack of wind becalmed both fleets. But then the wind picked up again on the 6th, and the fleets came into sight of Bologna as the channel began to narrow. With no word from Parma, and conscious that once past the Straits of Dover the current and winds were likely to take him north, Medina Sidonia decided that the fleet should now anchor off Calais until word came from Parma. Dunkirk was only slightly further down the coast and was potentially Parma's launching point. However, at this stage, despite almost daily letters, Medina Sidonia had no idea if Parma had even read a single one of his dispatches, since there had been no reply or even any form of acknowledgement. This was not, however, Parma's fault. The vagaries of land travel along the northern French coast, combined with the patrolling English and Dutch ships in the shallows, delayed the advance of Medina Sidonia's messengers. Indeed, almost every communication issued by the Armada between Portland Bill and just east of the Isle of Wight managed to arrive all on the same day, the day that the fleet set to anchor off Calais, since of course each messenger had a shorter journey to make as the Armada moved east along the channel and they were landed at the requisite mirror points on the French coast. Thus, Parma was only aware that the Armada was in the channel at all the same day that it showed up pretty much on his doorstep. And so, as the sun set on the 5th, the first reply from Parma arrived. This had been dated to 3 days earlier and was in fact a reply to a message that had been sent when the Spanish ships had still been sailing across the Bay of Biscay. In it, Parma revealed he would not have his army ready for sea until a week on Friday at the time of writing. The 6th was a Saturday. Parma therefore would not be ready for another 6 days. This was terrible news. The English fleet was anchored barely a mile away, reinforced by the ships from Portsmouth, and currently taking on resupply from the same. As soon as the fleets had passed the Dover Straits, 2 more squadrons, under Lord Seymour and Sir William Winter, both experienced sailors, which had been waiting in the Downs anchorage, had further increased the English fleet strength when they had sailed down to join Howard. With so many English ships so close, and numerous small Dutch ships in the shallows to the east, Medina Sidonia could not risk dispatching the galleasses and a few of his smaller ships to try and clear the way for Parma's craft, and he didn't believe for a moment that the amassing English fleet was going to leave him alone off Calais for almost a week. However, at this stage, Medina Sidonia's ignorance of naval warfare began to show in earnest. He seems to still have believed Parma's small craft could simply sail out to meet him when they were ready. Parma, on the other hand, was acutely aware of the 100 or so Dutch warships that were just waiting for him to try. He had little interest in sending tens of thousands of his veteran troops to their deaths in waters that were only just deep enough to drown in, with the English watching on as interested observers. Unless and until the shallow seas could be mastered, the Armada and Parma could stare at each other all day across the few miles that separated them and accomplish nothing to further their goals. To his credit, though, through misdirection, Parma had kept the Dutch fleet spread out, trying to cover all possible contingencies, and he had managed to assemble 70 small and medium-sized warships in Antwerp several months earlier, with an intention to sail them out to Sluis, where another formation of warships awaited. Then these would sail on to Dunkirk to pick up the barges of the invasion force in tow, but the aforementioned Dutch force, supported by the jointly held fortified coastal towns, sat in the Scheldt, preventing this. Not to be outdone, Parma had then changed his plan and made a big show of his largest ships, his biggest flagship still only 400 tons, and this had kept the attention on Antwerp whilst he deepened and widened the canals that led from Antwerp inland with the intention of moving the majority of his fleet along inland waterways to Ghent, whereupon he started work on widening the passages from Ghent to Nieuwpoort via Brugge, attempting to bypass the Dutch forces entirely. This had actually allowed him to assemble a good portion of his fleet, albeit the smaller vessels, in this area. They could then sail for Dunkirk down the coast, but his actual major warships, such as they were either still stuck performing distractions in Antwerp or just too large to sail down even these expanded waterways. This left him with the transport capacity, but none of the escorts that he needed to get that force out to sea. To his credit, though, Parma had ensured that the single largest Dutch formation was still in the Scheldt, blocking his escape from Antwerp, and his relocated smaller ships could pretty much sail immediately once the troops had been embarked, albeit there were still a couple of dozen Dutch ships offshore even in this position. Meanwhile, back out at sea, the Armada was at least taking on supplies, courtesy of the sympathetic governor of Calais, whilst the English fleet, now 140 ships strong, was having a few issues with its more exposed anchorage, which was driving ships together. And of course, the same message delays which plagued Parma and Medina Sidonia also meant that the English fleet had very little idea what the Dutch ships were doing or where they were. For all they knew, Parma's forces were completely primed and ready to sail the next morning. And thus, on the morning of the 7th of August, it was resolved to launch fire ships into the Armada that night. It seemed too good a chance to miss. The Armada was stationary, but outside of a major harbour. There were dangerous shoals to the east, and the wind and the tide were running in from the west. Both would bear the fire ships in on the Spanish formation rapidly, and also carry a confused Armada into the shoals, where it was hoped that God and the weather would account for them, at least according to one hopeful captain. 8 fire ships were prepared from the least useful vessels in the fleet, the owners carefully tabulating the cost for recompense at a total of £5,111 and 10 shillings. This reflects a modern cost, if you adjust purely for inflation, of about £1.5 million, or a more realistic economic cost equivalent to about £40 million. Either way, a relatively small price to pay for the devastating effects that were hoped for. To distract the Armada from the preparations of the fire ships, a vessel was sent in to conduct long-range bombardment of the Spanish fleet with its guns. The sacrificial vessels had their own guns packed with double shot, They would then fire randomly as the fires took hold as the ships swept in. In this effort, the English were playing psychological games as much as they were practical ones. Earlier in the Flanders campaign, the Dutch had employed so-called hell-burners. These were also sacrificial ships set on fire, but they had been heavily loaded with gunpowder and essentially used as floating bombs to rather devastating effect. The architect of that particular scheme, a somewhat eccentric pyromaniac by the name of Federico Giambelli, was known to have escaped the fall of Antwerp to England, and so Howard reasoned that whilst he could in no way afford to spare enough powder to create 8 gigantic floating bombs, the Spanish of course had no way of knowing this, and they had every reason to believe that Federico had come out with the English fleet and built some more of his favourite toys. On the other hand, Medina Sidonia had in fact anticipated such an attack and had placed a screen of ships out to guard against exactly such an attempt. But as it turned out, this only had limited success. When the 8 ships began to glow with internal flames around midnight, only 2 of the ships were grappled and hauled clear. The other 6 swept down on the fleet thanks to the rising winds and the tides. But the Duke had thought of this as well and had another line of defence. The ship's boats for the vessels that were facing the English fleet were deployed, and orders had gone out that a ship at risk of a fireship attack should slip her cables, the boats would secure them, the ship would then move out of the way, the fireship would pass, and then the ship could come back and retake position after the danger had come by. It might have worked. It should have worked. But, as we mentioned, the tide and the wind bore the fireships in far faster than you would normally have anticipated, the guns, as a result, beginning to fire at quite close range and setting panic in the fleet. Whilst the more experienced officers tried to organise the boat parties with poles to try and poke the fireships off course, the majority of the anchored ships just either cut their cables or tied them to buoys in the interests of speed instead of hoisting the anchors, and made off into the night. Around 300 anchors and their cables thus lay scattered across the sea, and the wind continued to rise. The fireships actually swept through relatively harmlessly in terms of direct damage. No Armada vessel was actually set on fire by them, but the Armada had now lost its formation. The ships could not fight their way back to the anchorage, and the wind and the tide were continuing to bear them east. A sense of fatalism appears to have overcome many Spanish commanders as the fleet melted away into the night. As the flagship passed Miguel de Oquendo aboard the mighty Santa Ana with a single N, and inquired as to Oquendo's course of action, the experienced and heretofore rather aggressive sailor shouted back, "I intend to fight and die well. Please send me more ammunition." As dawn broke, a small imitation of the Armada's Great Crescent formation formed around the San Martin, composed of some of the better commanded ships, but many more continued their headlong flight. A total of 32 ships rallied to their commander, most of them the big heavy fighting ships that had already seen much action along the Channel, but also had the best crews and the best commanders. As dawn revealed the chaos, the English squadrons raised their own anchors and charged. A third of the English ships under Drake and Hawkins went for the San Juan, San Felipe, Maria Juan, San Mateo, San Marcos, San Martin, and Santa Ana, 1N, these vessels comprising the left flank of the reduced Spanish formation. Seymour and Winter went after the San Juan Menor, Rata Encoronada, Reganzona, San Juan de Sicilia, and Trinidad Valencera. Howard's ships had chased down the San Lorenzo, the flagship of the galleasses, which had gone aground after colliding with the Rata Encoronada during the night and shattering its rudder. Since Ark Royal could not venture into the shallow waters in which even a galleass had failed to manage, Howard sent in swarms of boats instead, which overwhelmed the San Lorenzo after a protracted and vicious boarding action. With this done and the galleass ransacked, the flagship led its squadron into the thick of the confused brawl that was spreading along the coastline from Gravelines to Ostend. Thus played out the opening stages of the Battle of Gravelines. At this point, the historical record pretty much descends into chaos, as the vast amounts of cannon smoke and the general melee obscured the vision and perception of almost all the participants down to their local environment. And with their views limited to their immediate surroundings, this often led to mutually contradictory accounts of exactly what happened. However, pretty much all the accounts agree on a few things. Firstly, and most obviously, was that the battle was almost entirely fought at very short range, with many casualties suffered by both sides from musket and arquebus fire. The Spanish tried to grapple, but here the smoke and the mist actually worked against them, with English ships looming out of the murk, firing their guns, and then either speeding by or wheeling about before the grappling hooks and lines could be readied and thrown. Crews from both sides shouted insults that were heard and recorded by the receiving party, who returned the favour, and related to this was the agility of the more modern English ships, with many Spanish captains either remarking on the outstanding agility of their opponents or complaining that their own ships couldn't match the speed and turning capability of the race-built galleons. This, of course, allowed English ships to slip away from what otherwise might have been rather deleterious boarding assaults, and to also fire on the Spanish ships from a position of advantage, which essentially meant don't get in front of the bow of a Spaniard. Finally, learning from their earlier attempts to attack Spanish ships as they come up the channel, especially the recent assault on the Gran Grifon, squads of English ships sailed close in together and delivered heavy broadsides at point-blank range, where it was almost impossible to miss, and it was even possible for some of the better gunners to aim for specific parts of the enemy's ship, with the masts and the waterline being the most favoured targets. Sir William Winter recorded his heavy guns firing 500 shot that day, with none of them being fired further away than arquebus shot range. Aboard the San Martin, it was reported that one shot passed right through the mizzenmast, another took away a capstan, a third went through the ship from stern to prow. Another crewman said that although parts of the galleon had 7 layers of planking, the cannonballs went through them as if they were just 1 layer. In the aftermath of the battle, it would take several skilled divers to patch the holes underwater to make the Spanish flagship viable, and to bind its shattered planking and frame together with large ropes. The San Mateo was ganged up on by no less than 13 English vessels, and was reduced to a colander. Out of control, the 750-ton galleon drifted onto the shoals and went aground as night fell. Another dozen ships dogpiled the 800-ton San Felipe, shooting away her rudder, collapsing her foremast, and destroying a large amount of her main gun battery. Unable to steer, the San Felipe would also run aground later that night. The San Juan was likewise wrecked off of the coast, and the Maria Juan was so badly damaged that she would founder whilst in the process of surrendering. These were the direct losses of the battle, along with the San Lorenzo, which was lost in the run-up, but a great many other Spanish ships were extremely badly damaged, and this would contribute significantly to their loss later on as they tried to return home. Around 5 in the afternoon, the action finally began to die down, partially because the English ships were starting to run short of ammunition again, and partially because they were very aware of the local waters, and so began to draw away. The wind was driving the Spanish ships towards the Flemish sandbanks, and without anchors to hold their progress, and with many having lost or damaged masts, rudders, and sails, it seemed that the majority of the fleet was about to be run ashore and destroyed in very short order. But, at the last moment, the wind shifted to the southwest, and the battered collection of shipping was instead swept into the North Sea. Picking his way through the shattered upper works on the San Martin, Medina Sidonia fired his guns to summon the fleet to regain its formation, this being pretty much the only form of long-range communication available to him. No one responded. Small dispatch boats were then sent out to the ships that were visible to physically bring the captains aboard to answer for their insubordination. One of them was hanged, and many others were demoted or deprived of command. By noon on the 9th, the remaining ships of the Armada were in some sort of formation, the English fleet keeping their distance and watching as they in turn awaited resupply. Apart from the shortage of ammunition, unless the wind doubled back on itself, their main objective of preventing Medina Sidonia and Palma from linking up had already been achieved. Medina Sidonia summoned the surviving leading officers and informed them that the fleet was badly damaged, almost entirely out of powder, and many of the sailors and gunners were dead, and they had no secure anchorage in easy reach. They could try and double back to Parma or Calais. They could try and shelter in a port further along the coast, somewhere in what we would now call Germany or Scandinavia, or they could try and sail back to Spain, going around the British Isles, or, lastly, they could surrender to the English fleet that was following them. The decision was actually surprisingly close. Officers who were more motivated by practicality and wanting to save their crews' lives thought that surrendering at this point might actually be a good option. However, a larger number wanted to try and double back and fight if they could, with returning to Spain being their secondary preferred option if the wind didn't permit them to do an about-face. They waited for about a day, but with the wind still driving them north, Medina Sidonia ordered the fleet to press on back to Spain around Scotland and Ireland. Given that every plan drawn up before the Armada entered the Channel said that at this stage they should be sitting in a captured English harbour plundering it for supplies, and, of course, the voyage ahead of them was now considerably longer than the entirety of the voyage they'd done thus far, he was also forced to order rations reduced to pretty much a starvation level just to ensure that their food would last until they got home. Thus, the damaged, exhausted, and now hungry Armada passed north, followed by the English fleet, which was waiting for them to anchor again with another set of fire ships already prepared. Correctly guessing that the Spanish would make for home via Scotland and Ireland, Howard ordered Seymour's squadron back to guard the Thames just in case Parma somehow managed to make a last-minute dash for England whilst every fighting vessel in both the English and Spanish fleets was halfway up the North Sea, whilst the rest of the fleet resolved to pursue the Armada until it passed north of the Firth of Forth in Scotland. However, the English fleet was extremely short on ammunition, and lack of food combined with an outbreak of disease was already beginning to eat into its fighting strength. By the 12th of August, the English supply situation was becoming critical, but the Armada had reached the cut-off point, and so Howard organised one last grand broadside as a kind of long-distance, firepower-based and stay-out message before he ordered his ships home. The Spanish ships continued to run north, with several vessels struggling to keep up as damage worsened and their stocks of spare parts began to run out. Medina Sidonia set out his orders with a course that was calculated to safely pass around the British Isles, and 3 days after the English fleet had turned back, he ordered all ships to make for Spain at full sail. If you didn't have full sails left, or you were slow, then you would be left to fend for yourself. The route home wasn't an unknown. A lot of ships ran similar routes to get to Spain or the Mediterranean, if they started out in Scandinavian ports or had come from the Baltic. Indeed, many of the captains of the merchant ships in the fleet had sailed such a route before themselves, at least for the part that went around Scotland. The problem lay further south. Most of the routes advised there either sailed far out into the Atlantic to take advantage of winds and currents, or they cut down through the Irish Sea, with some concern that the English fleet was heading back to port to resupply and would then take the shortcut through the English Channel and come meet them in the western approaches or some other similar area, and with his ships too badly damaged and too short on supplies to sweep out far into the Atlantic, the Armada would be running down the west coast of Ireland, an area that most had very little knowledge of and for which the fleet had no charts. With 112 vessels left to his name, Medina Sidonia enacted a somewhat odd campaign in miniature as the fleet rounded Scotland. On the one hand, seizing a number of Scottish ships and taking on their crews, especially the pilots and navigators, which is a somewhat hostile act for a nation that he was hoping would rise up to help in his invasion, whilst on the other hand he sent a number of ships into port on their own to buy up as much fresh water and fish as they could, thus extending the overall supplies available to the fleet. But as the vessels passed between the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the summer winds vanished, and massive storms blew up one after the other, The temperature plummeted, and the crews were forced to seek what little shelter they could find in the hold of the ships. But now the weather began to claim its victims. The first to go was the Barca de Hamburg. On the 1st of September, this ship, struggling at the rear of the formation with a number of other slow vessels, signalled that she was sinking as her pumps could no longer keep up with the incoming water. The Gran Grifon and Trinidad Valenciera, also struggling to keep up, took 250 of her crew aboard before she sank, whilst the Castillo Negro stood guard. Unfortunately, the Gran Grifon went on to be wrecked itself off Shetland, whilst the Castillo Negro would sink off Donegal Island, and the Trinidad Valenciera, at 1,100 tons, one of the largest ships left in the fleet, would be the centrepiece of a tragedy that would be repeated time and again over the next few weeks. Badly damaged in the fighting, she struggled gamely around Scotland until by the 14th of September the leaks were beginning to overwhelm the pumps. The ship sighted Donegal and made for Loch Foyle, hoping to either regain some control over the flooding in calmer waters, or at least find somewhere somewhat sheltered where she could go aground. But without charts, they were traversing Kinnago Bay when the ship ran headlong into a reef that nobody spotted in time. The ship almost immediately foundered in shallow water, with the crew left in the forecastle, the only part of the ship that was still above water, as the bow was still stuck on the rock that they'd hit. Don Alonso, the captain, took some of the other officers ashore in the last remaining intact boat. Some locals gathered quickly and looted the officers, but they also let them hire a boat when the ship's own boat sank in the rough weather. Gradually, about 600 men were transferred off the wreck. Oddly enough, the accounts of the time record that one soldier, who was fed up of waiting for the boat, swam to shore with his helmet, a pewter plate, and a few of his possessions in a bucket that he pushed ahead of him. Then a wave washed over it, and the bucket sank, much to the soldier's distress. 4 centuries later, that exact same bucket, with that exact same set of contents, was found on the harbour bottom by archaeologists in modern diving gear. The locals now turned to looting the ship wreck, but on the 16th the ship broke apart under the waves, taking the 50 remaining crew and about 30 of the locals who were stripping it down with it into the waves. Still, the majority of the 600 survivors were veteran soldiers, and most of them had retained at least some of their weapons. The ammunition and most of the food might have gone down with the ship, but 500 men armed with swords and pikes, plus the occasional arquebus and small pouches of powder, were still a force to be reckoned with, and even the 100 sailors that were with them had knives and similar small weapons. But they were being led into a trap. The area they'd landed on was a peninsula, and there was only one way to go to access the rest of Ireland, and potentially meeting up with other ships who may have come to anchor further down the west coast. Alerted by some of the locals, an English garrison force of 400 men, somewhat better equipped, split evenly between cavalry and infantry, confronted the Spanish survivors and ordered them to surrender. Don Alonso refused, and thus a 2-day running skirmish set in. But by the end of it, what little ammunition and food the Spanish had been used up, and so they agreed to surrender in exchange for their lives. However, after 2 days of fighting through mud and rain, and perhaps somewhat intimidated by trying to take prisoner a force that was 50% larger than their own, the English forces instead stripped the Spanish naked, and then, trapping them between a line of arquebusiers and cavalry, cut them down brutally after having extracted the 30 men that they thought were worth ransoming. About 150 of the Spaniards managed to escape into the bogs, and between the weather and disease, only 46 of them managed to reach some kind of safety, with a dozen of the officers also surviving a forced march and eventually being ransomed. Something similar would befall many more Armada survivors as their ships were smashed into the Irish coastline by the ongoing vicious weather. Whilst the lucky few that ran aground early in Scotland, like the aforementioned Gran Grifon, had mainly the weather to worry about, and were generally somewhat safe once they reached civilization, in Ireland the crews of the San Marcos, Trinidad, Nuestra Señora del Sirocco, San Antonio de Padas, Girona, Gran Grin, Concepción de Juan del Cano, Duquesa Santa Ana, Nuestra Señora de la Rosa, San Esteban, Lavia, Rata Encoronada, Presveta Annunciada, San Nicolas Prondanelli, Juliana, San Maria de Visión, Castillo Negro, Falcon Blanco Mediano, Ciervo Volante, and at least 9 other ships whose names remain lost, found that they would generally be subjected to one of two fates. Either they were lucky and ran into some sympathetic locals. These men either simply blended into the population and settled down, which explains the run of many dark-haired, olive-skinned Irish people from the west coast that persists to this day, or they eventually managed to sneak home over time in small groups. For the rest, they were either killed upon landing by less friendly locals who simply wanted to loot them and their ship for all it was worth, or they were hunted down and killed by the English troops garrisoning the country. This came about as the English governor realised that he had far fewer soldiers than there were Spaniards in the process of landing, and many of the locals were not especially happy to have the English there already. The prospect of an armed uprising, led by several thousand veteran Spanish soldiers, led him to issue a kill-on-sight order for any Spanish survivors who were found ashore. The fact that whilst many Spanish ships did come ashore and get wrecked, many more would make it past Ireland, had led to multiple sightings of groups of Spanish ships off the coast, sometimes fairly large groups. This gave the impression of a large, if somewhat scattered, invasion force, much news of the Armada in the Channel having yet to reach Ireland. Eventually, orders arrived from London, after reports of the first Spanish ships going aground had gone from Ireland back to London in the first place, and it turned out that the Queen had ordered the Spanish survivors to be captured and held for ransom as bargaining chips, but these orders arrived far too late for many of the Spaniards who made it off the wrecks, only to find grim lines of swords and guns waiting for them. Eventually, on the 21st of September, the first of the Armada's survivors began to limp into Spanish ports. More would appear over the next few weeks, but this would then slow down to a trickle. Although modern researchers disagree on the exact numbers, it seems that of the 122 ships that sighted the Lizard a few months earlier, something between about 65 and 70 ships made it back, which means that somewhere between 50 and 60 didn't. Most wrecked by storms, but as we mentioned earlier, with a few combat losses, and a few ships stuck in various harbours. One, the hospital ship San Pedro el Mayor, eventually admitting defeat and coming ashore in Devon in early November. The survivors here were taken prisoner and put into care in local towns. According to Spanish records, which were fairly exact, 25,696 men had sailed with the Armada, of which 12,297 never came back. 10% of all Spanish losses coming from a single wreck, the Galleas La Garona, which had about 1,300 people aboard, including several crews who had been saved from other Spanish ships when it went aground at night off County Antrim and sank very quickly, leaving only 9 survivors. About half of the ships that made it back to Spain were assessed as completely irreparable and either broken up or left to rot out. A combination of disease and malnutrition swept through the survivors, wiping out many more who'd only just made it home. Miguel de Oquendo and Juan Martinez de Recalde both died this way, and Medina Sidonia himself almost passed on. Recalde's fate was especially tragic, for he had fought tenaciously to bring his ship and several others home against almost impossible odds, and had often given advice contrary to the majority, which may have changed the fate of the Armada during its advance up the Channel. But his story will need to be told separately another time. There was a dark tinge to the return of the English fleet as well. With disease sweeping the fleet, some members of court seem to have conspired to withhold the issuing of pay and the supply of provisions somewhat overly long on the twisted logic that dead men did not need to be paid, and thus the Treasury would save money on the overall campaign. The officers in charge of the fleet were incensed and horrified, but they couldn't do too much more than write angrily to the court and opened their own coffers to give what assistance they could when it was realised that royal assistance would not be forthcoming. A result of this debacle was the establishment of the Chatham Chest, where a portion of all sailors' pay in the future would be withheld for later payout should a sailor in the monarch's service become incapacitated by illness or injury, a system that wouldn't actually go out of use until the 19th century. As the scale of the defeat and the extremely unusual, exceptionally violent and often very sudden weather that had mostly contributed to it became clear, celebrations and commemorations spread out over England and the Netherlands, with most attributing the victory in general and the impact of the storms in particular to God. Various paintings and medallions were commissioned, with many taking inspiration from a biblical quotation found at Job 4 verse 9, which in the, at the time still in the future, King James Version reads, "By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils they are consumed," which is almost identical to within a word to the Bishop's Bible, which was an English translation that was current at the time, but is somewhat less extant now. Use of the Tetragrammaton, God's name in Hebrew, was frequent, and one of the most famous uses being the so-called Armada medal, which was actually made by the Dutch, not the English, which reads in Latin, using the Tetragrammaton, "Flavit Jehovah et dissipate sunt," Jehovah blew and they were scattered in English, which is often modified in later history books that have been subject to a superstition against pronouncing God's name to "Flavet Deus et dissipate sunt," God blew and they were scattered, although extant translations and commentaries of the time make it fairly clear that this was not an issue faced by the Elizabethan era English and Dutch. The Spanish seemed to agree, for the most part, with the English and Dutch sentiments, believe it or not, both for religious and political reasons, since it was far more palatable to the Spanish population to attribute their losses and defeat primarily to acts of God rather than to acts of the English. Indeed, at one point, King Philip is said to have remarked, "I sent my fleet to fight the English, not God and his winds and tides." But this would not mark the end of the armadas. In fact, the next year, in 1589, an English armada sailed for Spain. 1596 saw a joint English-Dutch force try again, and later in 1596, and then again in 1597, large Spanish fleets, just as large as the first one, tried to return the favour. As it turned out, every single one of these expeditions, except to a degree the Anglo-Dutch one, ended in utter disaster. Mostly, ironically, thanks to storms. So perhaps God had just decided that the latter part of the 16th century could just do without any more major naval invasions of other countries for the most part, thank you very much. But of course, the stories of some of those expeditions are for another time. The first Spanish Armada, though, would go down in history for both the scale of its failure and the shift in the balance of power it represented. Although Spain would remain a powerful player on the world stage for several more centuries, the battles that encompassed the First Spanish Armada campaign marked the beginning of a slow ascendancy for both the Royal Navy, albeit through the course of several conflicts in the following century against their former Dutch allies, and the start of the shift from primarily boarding actions to primarily gunnery-based naval combat. Again, something that would be refined in the forthcoming Anglo-Dutch Wars. Although, of course, we'll never know if Drake ever played or got to finish that game of bowls. Incidentally, you may have noticed a number of still renders like this and one particularly nice animation during this video, and a few in the previous video as well. If you happen to like them, well, firstly, thanks very much to the wonderful subscriber who goes on Discord via the name of Awesome for his awesome renderings and the work he's put into that. But if you'd like to have a crack at owning the models themselves, they are available as downloadable 3D printable STLs. They will be coming as part of a Kickstarter by another friend of mine who actually has done a lot of ship modelling in the past, which is why I asked him if I could commission these models. So they'll be available via a Kickstarter, link in the video description below. And for the sake of full clarity, I will not be making any money off of the Kickstarter in any way, shape or form. The only additional benefit I get if the Kickstarter is successful is I also get copies of the stretch goal STLs. Each ship is based off of period or shortly after period plans of specific ships. So you've got the San Martin, the Revenge, and various other smaller ships and some large transports thrown in there for good measure, to give a pretty representative mix of models to display the various types of ships that were present in both sides' fleets at the time. There's at least 2 more videos about the Armada coming, but this is the conclusion of the campaign itself. So in a few days, we're going to be looking at the role of Antwerp and whether or not the Armada was doomed because of that from the very start, even before it sailed. And then later on this month, we'll be looking at what the 2 sides were actually eating on their way up and down the channel.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.